On the morning of June 4, 2010, a 7-year-old boy stood in front of his science fair project, smiling for a photo his stepmother took on her cell phone. That photograph is the last confirmed image that exists of him. By 9 o'clock that morning, he had vanished from inside his own elementary school, not from a playground, not from a parking lot, from inside the building, in the middle of a school day, surrounded by teachers, parents, and staff. 16 years later, no one has been arrested. No one has been charged. No physical trace of this child has ever been recovered. Not one strand of hair, not one drop of blood, not one shoe. And the person investigators have spent a decade and a half circling has never spent a single day behind bars. This is the case of Kyron Horman. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why, after 16 years, thousands of tips, and one of the largest search operations in Oregon history, this case still isn't closed. Before we get into the theories, the suspects, and the 16 years of unanswered questions, I want you to actually know who this child was. Because somewhere along the way, in true crime media, in Facebook groups, in decade-old news segments, Kyron Horman stopped being a little boy and started being a case. I refuse to do that in this video. Kyron was 7 years old in June of 2010. He lived in the Portland, Oregon area with his father, Kyron Horman, his stepmother, Terry Horman, and his younger half-sister, who at the time was less than 2 years old. His biological mother, Desiree Young, lived separately and shared custody. By all accounts, from teachers, from family, from neighbors, Kyron was an unusually bright, curious kid. He loved animals. He loved science. For his second-grade science fair project, he'd chosen to study tree frogs, and according to people who knew him, he'd been excited about it for weeks. He attended Skyline Elementary, a small school tucked into the rural, forested hills of northwest Portland, the kind of place where a missing child case feels almost impossible, because everyone generally knows everyone else. That detail matters. Keep it in your mind, because it becomes one of the most unsettling elements of this entire investigation. June 4th, 2010 was Science Fair Day. It should have been one of the most ordinary, joyful mornings of that school year. Instead, it became the last morning anyone can confirm they saw Kyron Horman alive. Let's walk through this morning, minute by minute, because the timeline is the entire foundation of this case. That morning, Terry Horman drove Kyron to school. This is confirmed, not disputed by anyone, including Terry herself. She has said publicly that she brought him into the building for the science fair, that they walked through the exhibits together, and that she took that final photo of him next to his tree frog project. According to Terry's own account, she then walked Kyron toward his classroom, said goodbye, and watched him walk down the hallway toward his room. In interviews years later, she described it this way. She said her last image of him is the back of his head, almost at the classroom door. Kyron never made it to his classroom. He was never marked present that day. And here is the detail that still, to this day, unsettles investigators and parents alike. Nobody noticed. Not immediately. Kyron's absence wasn't discovered by a teacher scanning an empty desk in the middle of the day. It wasn't flagged by a hallway monitor. It wasn't caught by an office attendance check. Kyron Horman's disappearance wasn't discovered until the end of the entire school day, when the bus he was supposed to be riding home pulled up and he wasn't on it. Sit with that for a second. A 7-year-old child vanished from inside an elementary school building, and for the better part of an entire school day, hours, nobody knew. That gap is one of the most disturbing and most debated elements of the whole case, because it means that whatever happened to Kyron Horman had an enormous head start. Whoever took him, if someone did take him, had almost a full day before a single search dog, a single police officer, or a single roadblock existed. In a missing child case, the first few hours are everything. Kyron didn't get that. He got an entire lost day. When the bus arrived without him, the school contacted his family, and within a short time, Portland area law enforcement was notified. What started as a missing student call would, within hours, become something much larger and much darker. What followed was, at the time, one of the largest search and rescue and criminal investigation efforts in the history of the state of Oregon. Search teams combed the wooded, hilly terrain surrounding Skyline Elementary, terrain that, if you know Northwest Portland, is not gentle suburban backyard. It's dense forest, ravines, and rural roads that stretch for miles. Law enforcement brought in K-9 units trained to track scent. They brought in helicopters. They brought in hundreds of volunteers who walked grid searches through brush and along creek beds. The FBI was looped in almost immediately, given the possibility of abduction. Cadaver dogs, and I want to be direct with you here because this case deserves honesty, not softness. Cadaver dogs were used in certain search areas, which tells you how seriously investigators, very early on, were considering the worst-case outcome. And they found nothing. No backpack, no item of clothing, no physical evidence of any kind connecting to an abduction, an accident, or a crime scene. In most missing child cases, even tragic ones, investigators eventually find something. A trace, a fiber, a single confirmed sighting on a camera. In Kyron's case, after searching literal square miles of terrain with cadaver dogs, aircraft, and hundreds of trained searchers, there was categorically nothing. That absence of evidence became, in itself, one of the central mysteries of the investigation, because it ruled out, almost immediately, the most common and most tragic explanation in cases like this, that a child wandered off and something accidental happened nearby. If that were true, in terrain this thoroughly searched, something would likely have surfaced. It didn't, which meant investigators had to start asking a much harder question. Did Kyron Horman leave that building on his own, or did somebody take him? As investigators worked the case in those early days, one fact became the center of gravity for the entire investigation. The last confirmed adult to be with Kyron Horman that morning was his stepmother, Terry Horman. I want to be very precise and very fair here, because this is the part of the case where a lot of true crime content gets reckless, and I refuse to do that to you. Terry Horman has never been arrested. She has never been charged with any crime related to Kyron's disappearance. She has, in every public statement she's made, denied any involvement, and she is legally entitled to that presumption. I'm going to lay out exactly what investigators found and let you draw your own conclusions, because that's what this channel is built on, the facts, not the accusations. Here's what raised suspicion. In the days following Kyron's disappearance, multiple witnesses reportedly told investigators they saw Terry Horman that morning in circumstances that didn't line up with her own account of simply dropping Kyron at his classroom and leaving. According to reporting on the case, several witnesses described seeing her leading Kyron back toward her white pickup truck after the science fair, not toward his classroom. That single, contested detail, classroom or truck, sits at the absolute heart of this mystery. If Kyron walked into that hallway alone, this becomes an abduction case with an unknown assailant. If he walked back out to that truck, the entire case changes shape. Weeks into the investigation, Terry Horman was asked to take a polygraph examination. She has said publicly that she agreed immediately and answered every question truthfully. She failed it. She was tested a second time. She failed that one too. When investigators requested a third polygraph test, Terry Horman declined to take it. In later interviews, she has offered an explanation. She says she is deaf in one ear, that the polygraph examiner sat behind her during questioning, and that the delay in processing what was being asked caused her responses to read as deceptive. It's a real possibility, and polygraphs are famously unreliable as scientific instruments. They are not admissible in most courts for exactly that reason. But investigators at the time treated the failed results, combined with the witness accounts placing her near the truck, as reason enough to make her the central focus of the case. Just over 3 weeks after Kyron vanished, the case took a turn that had nothing, on the surface, to do with the missing boy at all, and everything to do with the man Terry Horman was married to. On June 26, 2010, detectives sat down with Kyron's father, Kyron Horman, and told him something that had emerged during the investigation, that Terry Horman had allegedly approached a landscaper who'd worked at the family home and solicited him, months before Kyron ever went missing, to murder Kyron in exchange for a large sum of money. 2 days later, Kyron filed for divorce. He took his and Terry's toddler daughter, Kyron's little sister, and left the house. He also filed a restraining order against Terry under Oregon's Family Abuse Prevention Act. In the filing, he wrote, in his own words, that he believed Terry was involved in Kyron's disappearance. According to reporting from the Oregonian, investigators took the alleged murder-for-hire claim seriously enough that they sent the landscaper back to meet with Terry Horman while wearing a hidden wire, accompanied by an undercover officer nearby. On that recording, the landscaper reportedly asked her for $10,000 and, according to reports, threatened to go to police if she didn't pay. Terry reportedly shut the request down and denied any such arrangement ever existed. Terry Horman has publicly and firmly denied the entire murder-for-hire allegation. In a later interview, she described it as a fabricated story from a man who, in her words, had an axe to grind after she rejected his advances. And to this day, 16 years later, she has never been charged in connection with that allegation either. But the story doesn't stop there. Shortly after these revelations, Kyron Horman discovered that Terry had paid a staggering $350,000 to retain her criminal defense attorney. For context, this was not a wealthy family living a lavish lifestyle. Kyron, through his legal team, filed a motion demanding Terry disclose where that money had come from. To this day, the full and public answer to that question has never been definitively established in the way the family wanted. A woman facing no formal charges, retaining an attorney for that kind of money, while failing 2 polygraphs, while being connected to an alleged murder-for-hire plot against her own husband, while being one of the last confirmed people with the missing child. This is the exact combination of details that turned Kyron Horman's case from a national news story into a phenomenon that still generates true crime content 16 years later. If Terry Horman is the central figure of this case, DeDe Spicher, sometimes spelled Spicer, is the second name that true crime investigators, journalists, and Kyron's own family have circled for over a decade. Spicher was described by Kyron's parents as a close friend and confidant of Terry's, someone who, according to Desiree Young and Kyron Horman, offered Terry advice and support that they believed was not in Kyron's best interest. In July 2010, a Multnomah County grand jury subpoenaed Spicher, along with several other people connected to Terry. Here's the detail that made Spicher a person of intense public interest. On the morning Kyron disappeared, Spicher was reportedly working, doing landscaping and gardening work, at a home in northwest Portland. According to reports, around 11:30 that morning, she abruptly left the job site and was unreachable for roughly an hour and a half before returning. Investigators, and later, searchers working with Kyron's family, focused significant search efforts around Old Germantown Road, the rural loop near where Spicher had reportedly been working that day. Search teams spent days combing that specific stretch of land. Spicher, for her part, has publicly disputed the account that she left her job site at all that day, telling People magazine directly that the reporting was inaccurate. Law enforcement has described Spicher as cooperative throughout the investigation. She allowed a search of her property and sat through hours of questioning. She has never been charged with any crime connected to this case, but in the years since, she and Terry Horman have remained linked in the public narrative of this investigation, 2 names mentioned together in nearly every retrospective, every documentary, every anniversary news segment, despite neither of them ever facing a courtroom over what happened to Kyron. Now, I think it's important, and this is something a lot of true crime coverage skips because it isn't as juicy, to talk about who investigators ruled out, because it tells you just how exhaustive this investigation actually was. Law enforcement cleared every single staff member and parent who was present at Skyline Elementary on the morning of the science fair. They cleared every neighbor living near the school. They cross-referenced and cleared every registered sex offender living in the surrounding area at the time of Kyron's disappearance. Investigators pulled surveillance footage from local grocery stores near the school in an attempt to track any unfamiliar vehicles or individuals in the area that morning. This wasn't a case where police looked at one convenient suspect and stopped digging. Multnomah County, alongside state police and the FBI, ran down thousands of leads. Strangers who called in tips, registered offenders with no connection to the family, delivery drivers, contractors, anyone who had been anywhere near that school that week. Every single one of those threads led nowhere. Which is exactly why, 16 years later, the investigation keeps circling back to the same small circle of people who were closest to Kyron that morning. Not because law enforcement gave up looking elsewhere, but because everywhere else they found nothing at all. While investigators worked the forensic side of this case, Kyron's biological mother, Desiree Young, has spent every single year since 2010 refusing to let this case go cold in the public eye. In the immediate aftermath, Young filed a civil lawsuit against Kyron Horman, attempting to hold her legally accountable through the civil courts, since no criminal charges had been filed. According to Young's own account, she eventually dropped that lawsuit, not because she stopped believing in it, but because, in her words, investigators told her that continuing to pursue it could jeopardize the flow of information law enforcement was sharing with the family. She has said she didn't want to be the reason that communication stopped. Since then, Young has become something this case rarely gets credit for producing, an advocate and an expert in her own right. She has spoken at law enforcement conferences about the dynamics of missing persons cases. She has counseled other parents living through the same nightmare. In 2020, 10 years after Kyron disappeared, she worked with author Rebecca Morris on a book called Boy Missing: The Search for Kyron Horman, a book that laid out, in far more detail than any news segment ever could, exactly why she and Kane came to suspect Kyron Horman and DeDe Spicher. And every single year, on June 4th, Desiree Young returns to Skyline Elementary. In 2025, on the 15th anniversary of Kyron's disappearance, she hosted a candlelight vigil at the school, surrounded by family and community members who came to share memories, photos, and videos, all, in her words, with one mission: to bring him home. "I never thought I would be here," she told reporters that year. "I've always thought Kyron would be home by now, whatever happened. 16 years, and that hope has never fully gone out." This is the part of the video I need you to pay the closest attention to, because this is not a cold case sitting untouched in a filing cabinet. As of the time I'm recording this, the Kyron Horman investigation is actively being worked, and it's being worked harder than it has been in years. In 2025, ahead of the 15th anniversary of Kyron's disappearance, Multnomah County's newly elected District Attorney, Nathan Vasquez, publicly announced a renewed, exhaustive review of the case. In his own statement, he described it as a painstaking process involving tens of thousands of pages of reports, records, and evidence, and he reaffirmed his office's continued commitment to finding answers. Alongside that, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office undertook a massive, multi-year project, digitizing the entire case file. Every page, every photo, every piece of evidence collected over a decade and a half, converted into a searchable, cross-referenceable digital archive. As of 2025, that digitization process was confirmed complete. Why does that matter? Because it means investigators can now do something that simply wasn't possible with a paper file this massive. They can run modern analytical tools across 16 years of witness statements, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, or corroborating details between witnesses who were interviewed years apart and never would have had their statements cross-checked against each other at this scale before. The sheriff's office is also partnering directly with the FBI to reanalyze evidence and witness statements using current forensic and investigative techniques, tools and methods that simply did not exist or were far less advanced back in 2010. The department has publicly stated it has increased staffing dedicated specifically to this case. 16 years after Kyron vanished, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office reports it still receives hundreds of tips about this case every single year. And there is still a $50,000 reward on the table for anyone with information that helps solve it. If you are watching this and you have even a fragment of information, something you saw, something you heard, something that never felt important enough to report, that tip line is still open and that reward is still active. I want to close out the investigative portion of this video by being honest with you about why this case has resisted resolution for 16 years, because it's genuinely one of the most difficult combinations of circumstances in modern missing persons history. There is no confirmed eyewitness to whatever happened after Kyron walked away from that science fair table. There is no publicly identified crime scene, meaning investigators have never been able to point to a specific location and say, this is where it happened. And after searching square miles of terrain with cadaver dogs, aircraft, and hundreds of trained volunteers, there is no definitive physical evidence that tells investigators with certainty what occurred. That triangle, no witness, no scene, no evidence, is what makes this case so uniquely difficult to prosecute, even if investigators privately believe they know who is responsible. In the American legal system, strong suspicion is not enough. Failed polygraphs are not enough. An unexplained 90-minute gap is not enough. A large, unexplained sum of money is not enough. Prosecutors need evidence that can survive a jury and a defense attorney tearing it apart, and for 16 years, that evidence has not materialized in a form that leads to an arrest. That is not the same thing as investigators giving up. It's the opposite, actually. It's why they're still digitizing files, still partnering with the FBI, still fielding hundreds of tips a year, 16 years later. This case is not closed. It is not cold in the way most 16-year-old missing child cases become cold. Somebody, somewhere, is still actively trying to find the piece that makes this case prosecutable. Out of this unimaginable loss, Kyron's family did something that I think deserves real recognition. They established the Kyron Horman Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting other families of missing children, advocating for better search protocols, and raising public awareness about how to respond in the critical first hours after a child goes missing. Kyron's case, for all its tragedy, changed how some school districts and law enforcement agencies think about accountability and check-in procedures for students. It's part of why, when you hear about school safety protocols today, sign-in and sign-out procedures, immediate parent notification systems, some of that conversation traces directly back to the gap of hours between when Kyron disappeared and when anyone realized he was gone. His family didn't just wait for answers, they tried to make sure other families would have a better chance than they did. Somewhere, right now, 16 years after that photo was taken, Kyron Horman would be 23 years old. He'd likely be finishing school, maybe starting a career. He'd be a grown man, not the 7-year-old boy frozen in every news article, every missing child poster, every documentary segment ever made about this case. His mother still shows up at that school every June 4th. His father still lives with a restraining order he filed against his own wife 15 years ago that has never been resolved by a conviction of any kind. And somewhere in Multnomah County, in a digitized file that now spans tens of thousands of pages, investigators are still looking, right now, while you're watching this, for the one detail that finally makes sense of what happened to him. We may never know exactly what happened at Skyline Elementary School on the morning of June 4th, 2010. But as long as people keep saying his name, keep sharing his story, and keep calling that tip line when something doesn't sit right, this case stays exactly what it's supposed to be: open, not forgotten. If you have information about this case, no matter how small it feels, The Multnomah County Sheriff's Office tip line and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children are both still active, right now, today. I want to ask you something before you go, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. After everything you just heard, the failed polygraphs, the murder-for-hire allegation, the $350,000, the unexplained 90-minute gap, where do you think the truth in this case actually sits? Do you think this was ever solvable with the physical evidence collected, or do you think the answer is sitting in a digitized file right now, waiting for the right person to finally connect it? Drop your theory below. I read every single one. This channel exists to make sure cases like Kyron's don't fade out of public memory just because time passes and the news cameras move on. If this is the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe to AMC True Crime and turn on notifications, because the moment there's a real development in this case, an arrest, a new piece of evidence, anything, you will be the first to know. Kyron deserves that. His family deserves that. I'll see you in the next one.